which, as you may have gathered, I now do have recording switched on, and I'll also just put the captions on as well, hopefully. That should pop up on the screen. Yep, so that's switched on. Right, so let's start properly. So welcome everyone to our weekly call. I hope you didn't have anything other than a relaxing and peaceful weekend. Although, as we were discussing just before I started recording, those of you that live in the sort of west of England or indeed Wales, probably not such a relaxing weekend with unexpectedly high winds, making things a little bit unpleasant for some. So anyway, let me share my screen just to give you a reminder of what we're planning to cover on the call today. So hopefully that's appeared on your screens as well. So the plan today is we're going to spend a little bit of time just discussing DNS resolver discovery. The rationale for that is it's just over a year since the relevant standards were published by the ITF, so RFCs 9462, Discover of Designated Resolvers, 9463, DHCP and Router Advertisement Options for the Discovery of Network Designated Resolvers, probably not the snappiest title, or DDR for short, and also the related service binder mapping for DNS servers document as well. So I thought, as it is just roughly a fraction over a year since they were published, it would be interesting to spend a little bit of time just discussing that, kindly with at least two of the co-authors of one of the standards on the call. That's Tiru and Neil, as well as David as an implementer. Possibly with colleagues, and also, although I didn't put him on the slide because I wasn't 100% sure if he was going to be able to join, John Todd might chip in with some sort of stats showing if there's been an uptick in encrypted DNS traffic, if he's able to access that data whilst we're talking. So it'd be a fairly gentle discussion, I feel. If there are any other co-authors have joined, I can't immediately see any on the call, but make sure I'm aware of it, but then just chime in, and anyone else with any comments that you want to make, again, feel free to just join the discussion, either by talking, or if that's less easy for you, depending on whereabouts you are, just put something in the chat and I'll make sure we call it out. And then after that, we'll see how long that takes time-wise. Time permitting, we sort of touch on some of the recent developments from the last week or so in the news. I'd like to highlight some forthcoming deadlines, etc. And time permitting, we may even touch on some any other business. So, okay, that's the plan. Hopefully that's not a surprise for anyone. So probably first things first, probably ought to start by asking sort of Tiru and Neil to join the discussion initially. Probably seems like a long time ago, I'm guessing, gentlemen, since you actually sort of were writing the DDR document. What's your take on how the last year's gone in terms of, I don't know if you've seen much take up by client software, any comments that have come your way on the document, etc. So reflections on the last 12 months and what you've learned, etc. Feel free just to jump in on that, and we'll take the discussion from there.
Well, I mean, I think in terms of adoption, both in terms of clients maybe and resolver infrastructure implementing them, it seems that DDR has got more traction. We certainly see, because I mean, obviously, as not just an author, but as I work for PowerDNS, so we have customers deploying DNS and encrypted DNS. And I think I have a couple of observations. So one is that yes, DDR has been deployed. Certainly, we see in some clients, so Windows clients and Apple clients as well. I think Apple have actually implemented DDR and DNR, I think that's unique right now. But I think one of the things that's interesting is that DDR doesn't solve the issue that a lot of what we see, and certainly our customers as telcos see, which is that most of their traffic is behind caching proxies or caching resolvers in CPE equipment, which is what DNR is more designed to solve. And I haven't seen much uptake on the DNR side, apart from, I say, Apple on the client side. And I have seen almost no uptake or requests or comments or questions or whatever on the DNR side from like CP manufacturers or people who are doing that sort of thing. We certainly have quite a lot of interest in from telcos in that, because it's a big problem they want to solve. But I haven't seen a huge amount of progress in that. Another thing I would mention is mobile networks. So that they don't have typically this issue with caching proxies. But one of the major, apart from Apple, obviously, as I say, they've done a great job on this. Google Android is not supporting DDR as far as I can see right now. They'll do automatic DOT upgrades just based on port querying, I think. So that's another potential blocker to uptake. So I don't know, Tiru, if you have any other thoughts?
Thanks, Neil, for the update. I can give you an update from 3GPP, right? I mean, now that I work for Nokia, right? I mean, I used to work with Neil when I was previously working at McAfee, and we were collaborating where McAfee was hosting secure network elements, basically on CPEs. Our basic idea was to inspect the traffic, right? DNS and other type of traffic for identifying the type of devices, and then also filtering malware, enforcing parental control, and blocking any bad traffic, right? And we had a lot of intelligence with regard to segmenting the network, identifying the IoT device types, and then enforcing policies depending on the IoT device type, make, and model. But DNS was one of the in addition to, we were also doing TLS inspection, DNS filtering, and other features. But DNS was one of the key features that we had for filtering and blocking malicious domains, and there we had a challenge that with encrypted DNS, we wanted to basically have that support on CPEs, where we could inspect the DNS traffic and block domains, right? So as part of that, right, I think we started the work on the DNR draft, because that was the only way we could see that we could host encrypted DNS forwarders on CPEs, and then it would allow endpoints to discover and use them, right? But then I would like to elaborate on what Neil was saying, that even in 3GPP, there's a huge amount of discussion that's just happened, I believe, because mobile networks also want to upgrade themselves to support encrypted DNS resolvers. But one of the challenges, I think, both the proposals, DNR and DDR, came into the discussion as part of 3GPP. The challenge with DDR is the certificate issuance, right? How we haven't encountered any CAs which today currently support, like you use Acme or something, and then you talk to any public CA and you say that I own this IP address. Can you give me an certificate owning that IP address, right? So that's one issue that we see currently, is that right, DDR, because of the way that operators typically use public CAs, we have not figured out the best way DDR could be used because of the dependencies on CAs not supporting IP addresses. And the other challenge was that we encountered is that many of the operators want to provide this DNS resolvers just to the subscribers. So they want to keep it restricted to private IP addresses and not give it a public IP address, right? Now that could be done differently, that it could still be a public IP address, but blocked access for anyone outside the uh, uh, domain of the mobile network. But those are two challenges that I have seen, and DNR works much easier in even in a mobile network scenario, right? I mean, you just need to get a cert, and then you just prove a domain, and then the current mechanisms like DHCP do work in mobile networks, right? So I think that's one area that I think we've been discussing, and that's the one of the DNR seems to be like a potential solution that could be deployed in mobile networks as well because of some of the shortcomings that we are facing with regard to DDR.
Interesting. I guess that's certainly the sort of thing you really sort of come across when people start to deploy in anger and actually think about real world scenarios. And I guess partly why, as you both rightly said, DNR was implemented to solve the problem of things like private IP addresses, etc., to suit the needs of network operators. Kathleen, I saw your hand go up, and then Ralph. So I'll let you both come in, and then perhaps ask David and possibly Tom to give their thoughts from the point of view of actual current implementers, to give a sense of your take on things. But Kathleen first, then Ralph, and then I'll come to David.
Thank you. So I'd like to see if I can help on the Acme front. And maybe it requires an offline discussion. I'm about to resubmit a draft that was previously adopted and I let it expire, but I'm going to bump it back up because I think I was just too soon on it. And the draft allows for new challenge types to be added, but they're user-specific ones. And one of the misconceptions with Acme is that it's just for web, right? And it's not. Any CSR type can be used with Acme and other challenge types can be added. So my draft was meant to add flexibility in specific to code signing certificates, but now it's also relevant for cloud native type applications where you're signing various aspects that allow you to prove integrity and authentication between workloads, for instance. And so I will be updating that, and it might be a separate draft, but I'd like to understand more your requirements on being able to have a certificate and set of keys associated with an IP address. And maybe I can help with getting that, getting through what you need. But I'll have to get deeper with you on the requirements. So if you want to reach out, I'm happy to discuss.
Yeah, Kathleen, I'll reach out to you on that. I think there is an RFC which talks about how to get certificates with IP addresses, where you prove using a HTTP server that you own that IP address, basically with a request response challenge. But the challenge that we
but you might have a different challenge type that you want, not that. Right?
Yeah, whether that challenge works or not, that was one issue, right? And the other issue was we have never seen any, at least in my interactions with the CAs, we have not seen any CA or even Let's Encrypt when we were interacting with them, they were not supporting the IP address based certs, basically, right? So that was another challenge. But I think it will be interesting to have that discussion.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Thanks, Kathleen. Just out of interest, whereabouts would that be submitted? And this is probably my ignorance. I'm sure everybody else knows. But which working group would that belong in as a draft?
Acme working group. I'll just put it in the chat window.
Okay. Thank you. Ralph, did you want to come in?
Yeah. So on the, CA side, sure, there's nothing kind of public, but I think if you want to shell out money, DigiCert does it for IPv4 and v6, and I believe we use 0SSL, which does IPv4 only. So there are CAs out there, but it's not easy and it's not cheap. The other thing I'm really interested in, because I've saw DNR working live once, and that was the hackathon, I believe 2 IETFs ago. and there was something both from Microsoft and Apple, but I never thought that anything had made it into public releases. So if that's the case, have you seen it, and can you maybe point us to instructions how to set this up with Kia or any other DHCP server for testing?
My information was from Tommy Pauly, and that was a while ago, and I'm pretty sure he said that DNR was in macOS and iOS now.
I'll happily take an action to reach out to Tommy post call if that'd be useful, Ralph, just to ask for clarification on that.
If you want to set it up with things like Kia, I do have a GitHub page which has got a Go binary which you can use to generate the various options it needs.
Yeah, I mean, if you can point me that, then I can probably take it from there.
Yeah.
Thanks a lot. I
can probably put that in the chat on here as well.
Thanks, Ralph. Thanks, Neil. Okay, I'll come to David next just to get his sort of well, you can comment however you like, David, from an implementer sort of point of view, and then perhaps I come to John after that to ask about if anything's showing on the resolver side that might indicate greater use of encrypted DNS. But David first.
Sure. Hello, everybody. David Redekop here with ADAMnetworks, and we are an implementer of the RFC 9462 specifically. And our approach is that we took the opportunistic resolver piece, if you go through the RFC, because in most scenarios where we are applicable is at the edge of a network that we protect with a zero trust DNS or zero trust connectivity, as we call it. Microsoft calls it a ZTDNS. And it's really done with ACME protocol so that our environment and our controller in the cloud never is in possession of the private key, so that the actual optimized DNS caching resolver, that's our product that sits at the edge of a network, ends up being the one that is in ownership of that SSL private key and only there. And so then what we do is we just support that initial DNS query. And I can tell you that since iOS 18, I can, if we have time today, Andrew, and you wish to see it in action, I'm ready here to show you the moment that my phone joins this Wi-Fi network. The very first query it asks is, what's my escalated DNS security? And then we give it the answer. And then, of course, with the opportunistic mechanism, you can't put a certificate on the alt name for the IP address, but you can still have a split horizon DNS answer, an internal network that can be validated. And so that's our approach. And that works, and it works like a charm. And I can tell you that iOS, macOS, tvOS, in fact, in my house, Apple TV says, "Hey, do you have secure DNS for me?" I find that interesting. So yeah, that is working, and it works well.
Out of interest, you mentioned the various Apple operating systems, David. Have you looked towards either Microsoft or indeed Android for implementation, or was there a particular reason for focusing on Apple?
Well, that's a good question. I have on the latest Android. I still do not see that, and I'm just using a One Plus, so it's plain vanilla running Oxygen OS. It does not, and Windows, my latest Windows 11 Pro, fully patched, does not do that query, and I have not gone deeper to see if there's a way that I can force it. We tend to respond to what we're seeing happening en masse. And we really accelerated this when iOS 17 beta came out, and I saw the first _DNS.resolver that out. I'm like, what is this? So then we quickly got caught up. And just out of curiosity, if anybody's interested, I asked that robot behind me right here said, what have we done so far in terms of queries? So out of 800 sites that offer to send their anonymized data to our SIM, we've had 142,000 queries so far this morning. So it is quite distributed in terms of the adoption. Obviously, any place iOS joins the Wi-Fi, that's going to be the first thing that it asks. So if a network is ready for it, Apple's ecosystem says, I'm ready to use it.
Fantastic. Ralph, you raised your hand. Did you have a question?
No, it was an answer. I mean, as in the chat, HomePods also works. Pretty much everything Apple does, the DDR upgrade. On Windows, I mean, I haven't tested this for a long time, but the initial batch of Windows, you had to enable it with a netshell command. I believe that still is true, which makes it, of course, not ideal for automatic adoption, because you have to enable that command, or I guess you also can, an enterprise admin probably also can set it, but that's the crux with Windows, and I haven't heard that this is about to change.
Okay, thank you, Ralph. Helpful clarification. Tiru, did you want to come in as well?
Hey, thanks, David, for the update. I mean, any quick question of that? What are the challenges you're facing to migrate from opportunistic to verified discovery in TDR, or are you planning to continue to support only the opportunistic discovery mode?
That is a good question. Our primary use case for our customer base today, opportunistic is the only thing that would apply strictly RFC standard, because the typical network on the inside is using link local or RFC 1918 addresses. And so that would be our only option. In theory, nothing would prevent us from supporting the verified, but we run into the same issue is, how would you automate that with Acme? So the moment that can be automated with Acme, then it would be a small lift for us to apply the same changes.
Got it.
Thanks, Tiru. Ralph, did you want to come back in on that?
Yeah, I just now I missed that you were doing opportunistic, because I can tell you that doesn't work with Windows, no matter how many netshell commands you use. They just don't support that. And again, I don't think they have plans on supporting that. So maybe going the way on doing authenticated is a good way forward for you, because that's, I think, what I would suppose for anybody to do, use public IP addresses, because the opportunistic, and Apple also, I mean, during their they have that in since a couple of releases now. But it happened that 1 or 2 betas, it like the opportunistic stopped working, and then they re-added again. So I think the most stable case for DDR is with the authentication over the IP address, which is a bit of a pain to configure, but that's probably the way to go.
Yeah, and in my discussion with Tommy Jensen, I think they have made a conscious decision not to support the opportunistic mode. So that's going to be an issue that we will be forced to support the verified discovery mode. And in case of DNR, anyway, it's verified discovery. You have to validate the domain name and then use PKI to validate the domain name. So
I know Tommy unfortunately couldn't make it on the call today because he's been sort of traveling for several weeks. I think he's got a bit of a backlog of work, but if he watches the recording, perhaps he might want to come back with some comments on Microsoft's plans and if that's likely to change in the future. So Tommy, if you're listening, it'd be great to have that clarification, perhaps post-call if you're able. Okay, let me go to John and then David. I'll maybe come back to you since you sort of bravely offered a live demo. So perhaps let John make a few comments, and then if you're in a position to do a demo, we'll perhaps do that next. So you've got a little bit of advance warning rather than doing it sort of completely cold. But John, well, 2 things really. Well, partly you put a comment in the chat, so that'll give you a chance to. You referenced Dane, but also more generally in terms of traffic, whether you've seen any material change in encrypted DNS traffic over the last 12 months or so.
So actually, let me go back and make a couple comments. One is that I think one of the challenges that we have with DDR in general is the getting the IP address in the certificate. And the fact that, as Ralph mentioned earlier, that right now, as far as we're aware, there's only one certificate authority that supports both V4 and V6 addresses, and that's DigiCert. That's a critical problem that we need to solve. There need to be more certificate authorities that understand that they need to put IP addresses into certs for DNS servers because it's just, and every time we talk to them, it's like talking to someone from Mars, right? They're like, you want to put an IP address in what? A V6? Where? And, they're like, oh, we'll just connect to the web server. I'm like, no, it's not a web server. It's a DNS server. So I can't just put files in there. So every year we have to call them and go through this big dance back and forth about, okay, validate this. Is your phone number right? Is your email address correct? And like this, it takes, a day or two to get it done. It's not like Acme where it just automatically happens. It's a real pain. And so that I think stands in the way of this being done on the server side at a larger scale because it's just so difficult. And like the secret knowledge of who you need to talk to at DigiCert to get this done, like that shouldn't be the way an entire technology stack works. And to the next comment, like, why aren't we using Dane for this? But I think that the bigger discussion than this call is really interested in talking about, but like we have a model to do this in the DNS. Why do we keep not doing it in the DNS? Um, so getting to the real question as far as like what we're seeing. So we've implemented DDR quite some time ago. I think we were one of the first to do it. And so the challenge for us also is disambiguating growth of encrypted traffic because of DDR versus growth of traffic just because we're growing at some ridiculous amount per week. I will say this, though. I've been looking at stats since the start of the call, and I hadn't looked at this in a while. We have stats on how many SVCB records we produce because we synthetically generate those. So I have records on like how many essentially DDR requests we're serving. And these are specifically for DDR. They're not just SVCB in general. And that number is very interesting in the last 30 days. We're seeing a much larger growth in that. I'm looking at just like week over week deltas. Today, we see 7.2% more SVCB DDR requests than we did last week. And if I go back a week previous to that, we're seeing 5% more than we did the week before that. So like we've almost, depending on whether you look at the peak day or not, we're 40% more SVCB queries today than we had 30 days ago. So my suspicion there is that it's one of two things. And it's very hard to disambiguate these. One is that a new class of devices has just had a software rollout that is supporting DDR, or that somehow a class of devices is better supporting DDR. So that's interesting. But it also could be, and this is the part where it gets tough, that a large number of ISP clients have had Quad 9's resolvers directly added into their query set for their DNS, so they're upgrading automatically. I don't know. I can't tell the difference because we don't store information about clients. I really can't tell you where those are coming from. To the secondary question, which is, have we seen an increase in encryption? The answer, of course, is yes. We see normally around 2% per week, sometimes less, sometimes more, depending on the time of season, in growth across the network in general. So yes, encrypted traffic is growing. Is encrypted traffic growing at a significantly faster rate than normal query growth is across the network? No, not really. It's slightly ahead, but it's not doubling, right? It's not massively more. And again, I attribute that to most of the fact that most of our query traffic is not actually end clients. Most of our query traffic is coming from forwarding caches, whether those are on CPE or whether they're at the ISP level. Like 85 or more % of our traffic comes from essentially a forwarding server of some sort. So the end clients that are upgrading with DDR is relatively small on the network, but we're seeing a few thousand queries a second for SVCB. I think the number is right now it's around 2,500 or so SVCB per second. queries across the network, but that number is the SVCB query set is growing. Is the encrypted traffic growing with it? Not at that growth rate, no. So it may just be a small number of queries or a small number of end users who are doing more queries, but as far as the volumetric traffic of what we see on the network right now from encryption, it's not spiking at that same level. But that's sort of expected. So we are very interested in DDR. I think it's a great thing to do. But we also understand that most network providers in some way want to keep that traffic local, so they're trying to put it to their own resolver first, et cetera. We're not seeing the adoption. So, and this is a secondary but not discovery layer. We're not seeing the adoption of encryption from as many forwarding servers as we would like. The forwarding caches or whatever it's going to be that are sending us the queries are not doing encryption at the same level as we expected. There was an initial burst of that when DOT first came out. People were experimenting with sending us the encryption traffic over a DOT session, but that has not grown at the same rate, at least in anecdotal examination, as we were expecting it to. So it would be great to see DDR on more forwarding cache systems. I'm looking at you, Neil. So that would be interesting to see, and I think that would improve and increase the volume of encrypted traffic on the network.
So if I can respond to that. So DNS Dist actually does support auto upgrade of its backends using DDR now. So
really, okay, I wasn't aware of that.
Yeah, you have to enable it, but it will do.
Okay. Because I know you can manually specify encryption on DNS Dist. You can say that it's a DOT or DOH endpoint. I wasn't aware that it supported auto upgrade. Okay, great.
Uses DDR.
Great.
Good to know. Thanks, Neil, and thanks, John. There's some interesting stats there. Okay, well, let's we'll go to David in just a second to see if that live demo's feasible. Having done many live demos myself in the past, we'll cut you lots of slack if for some reason it doesn't work when it's ready for prime time. I'm sure we've all been there when that's happened for inexplicable reasons. But again, just for a bit of advance warning, what I'll then do is I won't go to anyone specifically, but I know we've got a number of people on the call working for various network operators. It will be fascinating to get your take on either any thoughts or any plans to migrate to encrypted DNS, because network operators do seem to be, so if I say laggards, I don't mean that in a derogatory sense, but slow for adoption of encrypted DNS. So any plans for that, or indeed any significant barriers preventing that adoption, would be good to hear about if anyone's able to share. Risk averse, thank you, John, in the chat. Yeah, quite right. That's a much better way of putting it. But anyway, the first things first, David, if that demo does work, now's a good chance to share it if you're able.
Yeah, no, absolutely. There really isn't much to it. This is just the terminal on my MacBook that I'm at, and I'm sitting behind one of our resolvers, a gateway that does the Zero Trust DNS. And so if I just ask for the _DNS .resolver.arpa, you're going to get the standard that you would expect in terms of a response. This here is not publicly accessible. Right, so this is your typical split horizon environment in an SMB or a small enterprise, where it's a validated certificate. So if I were to, I'm not going to try and type this out. So I had this in my cache already ready for the demo. If I were to now do a curl command to do a DOH query against that, you'll see that I do end up getting the response here for example.com. And that was all done over that query right there internally. So it validates it. Obviously, it goes through what you expect, and then it closes the TCP 443 session off. So in an internal network, you're typically not concerned about any level of performance. You have to have quite a large DNS hit before moving to DOQ becomes essential. So that's the first part. Or that's really the part of the demo I thought I could quickly demonstrate. And really, it's just a matter of turning the toggle on in the dashboard for a subscriber of ours. And I could also show you, if you're interested in having my Wi-Fi device join the network for the first time, and then have it automatically ask for it. So if I just do let me reshare the screen, and I will just look for that example here for you. So if we were to just filter for that right there, and I'm just going to go ahead and turn Wi-Fi off on it. And now it's off, and I'm turning it on, and boom, there you go. So very, very immediately, you'll see that SVCB query coming in, and it becoming getting answered with the DOH path that it can use. And its very first query, sometimes I see it happening before captive.apple.com. The captive portal. Usually it's immediately after it does the captive portal verification.
Very good. Always good to see a live demo without some horrible error message cropping up unexpectedly, just to keep everyone excited. Fantastic. Thank you for that, David. If anyone's got any comments or questions, you can sort of pop those in the chat or raise your virtual hand. But whilst you're thinking, let me just pop the question in. So I won't call out anyone in particular, but anyone on the network operator side, have you any comments you wish to make about sort of barriers to adopting, whether it's DDR, DNR, or similar type approaches to allow the upgrade to encrypted DNS? Anyone want to share any thoughts?
Maybe this is of interest. The question hasn't come up, but sometimes this does come up after a minute or two. So how do you then respond if it does go directly by IP, since we're opportunistic, right? So if I were to try to make that connection directly to just the IP address, then we do an immediate connection reset by peer. And that way the endpoint doesn't try, it's not slowing down, it's not doing a retry, it doesn't even get a chance because the SNI header is blank.
Oh, very good. And very fast responses as well. That was pretty instant, you could see. Thank you, David.
Yeah, and that comes from the background of, the old days sysadmins would hesitate going to the executives and want to implement security because the fear was always, the moment you do that, you're introducing latency and problems. So honestly, a big driver for us in developing this was, how do we provide value and extra speed and extra security? Because then there's no reason to say no. So that was the decision behind really being focused. And Tom is on the call here. He'll remember the many sessions we had. That we got to find a way for this to be super fast. It cannot slow people down.
Yeah, very true. If you inject the latency, it gives people reasons to not want to do it. Tiru, did you want to come in?
Yeah. Hey, David, I had a question. I mean, in this case, I think you're using a split horizon domain or a local domain, I believe, right? What's the point of doing any validation? I mean, opportunistic allows you to have any certificate, and it need not match any of the domain names, right? I mean, it should still work, right? The client is not supposed to do any validation as per the DDR spec.
Well, in this case, it can still do validation on the FQDN, right? The issue is that if you were to then, I haven't really played with DNR at all, but if you were to do DNR, then by domain, it would still validate. The other reason is that we actually provide user-facing value. So one of the things I did not want to keep you guys on a demo for too long, but if I were to, this is basically the same FQDN we use then to give an endpoint real-time visibility into what's going on. So if I were to do another query on my endpoint for bad actor.co, let me type that out now, then you'll immediately see it showing up here that's malware And this whole user interface then also it becomes appified on iOS, so that there is detail surfacing. So that's another reason why we just wanted to have the internal feedback loop to an endpoint or to a sysadmin, or this same thing going to a SIM environment, for example, to have that not be stumbled upon because the certificate is invalid. I don't know about you, but I absolutely hate when I end up going to an internal resource and then I have to acknowledge that this is an insecure site, right? So we like to use real certificates, especially with Acme. There's no reason why you can't have all your internal stuff work. So we never use non-delegated TLDs, obviously, because then even that wouldn't work with Acme. So using proper, I remember when years ago the standard was, use something .local or non-delegated TLD. It's actually very interesting at the DNS work where I met you, Andrew, and John. The amount of non-delegated TLDs that make it to the root servers. And that's the reason why, because that used to be our standard. But now the standard is use your actual registered domain with an internal suffix, with a split horizon or an internal only. And that's the other thing that we've also experimented with, it just have that QDN not even resolved publicly, only internal, but it's still one that can be Acme certified. So there's lots of different ways that we can still modify things in the future. We're flexible enough, but this is the implementation that we think matches the user's needs.
I think that's very similar to how we had done it even for CPEs when we were hosting the encrypted DNS forwarders on millions of them. So we had unique domain names for each of these CPEs, but they were not publicly exposed. But we got from Acme basically the PK asserted certs basically, right? So that endpoints without any bootstrapping can validate using PK and validate that the domain that's come in DHCP RA matches that one. So I think that's an interesting one that I see that it's going to be quite useful, especially for split horizon discovery. For instance, if you see there's another spec that we have, I think it's in RFC editor, which talks about if you have split horizon domains and the endpoint is configured to use a public resolver and not the local one, you could still resolve the local domains, right? Right, and that's I think this paves the way to basically discover those domains using the PVDs and the other approaches in that document, and then validate that they are indeed being hosted by the operator of the network and not being overwhelmed, or basically the enterprise network taking over some public domains and claiming its own so that they can send spoofed responses, right? So I think that's also a major issue as well, especially for enterprise networks with BOD devices.
Yeah, I mean, one of our use cases is a large enterprise network in our country where this allows them to have a 100% guarantee that there is no leakage of any private DNS. But the only downside to doing it this way is worth saying is that because of certificate transparency, it makes it rather trivial for someone to enlist all of the domains that you've all the certificates you have for your unique FQDNs, right? But if there's no A record that exists past that, then it's still of limited value to an adversary.
Right. Yeah, and using wildcard certificates, you can have a prefix and then make sure that all the subdomains which are private are not exposed to the CA transparency logs and CA as well, because you don't want them to know all our internal project domain names.
Right.
That makes sense. And what is your enterprise deployment like? Is it like more of what kind of enterprise deployments do you have? Like, could you throw more light on that?
Yeah, they tend to be distributed in nature, where you've got many sites, and each site has between 20 to a few hundred assets. One of the things that we felt the need to early on in our design was for control to be centralized, but for protection to be decentralized, for DNS to be as decentralized as it can be. I'm saying that while we still use protective resolvers like Quad 9. But at least from a enterprise standpoint, that those be decentralized, where each site reaches out to the internet directly instead of a backhaul. But that means you necessarily need to offer the protection at a decentralized level as well. And we're starting to see that in a number of industry, including finance, with regional banks, for example, are moving in the direction where in the next 3 to 5 years, they're rapidly moving towards egressing each branch's data to the internet rather than a full backhaul, and then utilizing their VPN to data center only for what's needed. And that's possible when you do proper decentralized protection. And this is a part of the core.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, that's very similar to split VPN and the SD-WAN strategy that's being pushed in enterprise networks. So that makes sense.
Yes.
Thanks.
Correct.
So, well, thank you for that extra demo, David. Some bonus demo. That was good to see. I've not seen a rush of sort of people working network operators wishing to comment, which is perfectly fine. Maybe if you have got any comments you wanted to share privately and unattributably, if there is such a word, I'll be happy to consolidate those in a very anonymized way if that's useful, because it would be interesting to understand what the blockages are, other than the obvious one. I know the sort of lead times to modify CPE can be quite significant, so it might just be that. But if there's anything perhaps beyond the CPE sort of timeframes, it'd be useful to know. All right, let me just go back to sort of Neil and Tiru to see if you've got any last comments you wanted to share just before we briefly move on, if there's anything else you wanted to say that hasn't occurred so far.
I don't think so. I'm still looking forward to more clients supporting DDR and DNR. Particularly disappointed that Google don't seem to have done anything yet. Yeah.
And thanks, by the way, for your link to the one to the DNS dist with auto upgrade option in the chat, Neil. That's useful.
So I have an update to share. Like, I mean, I know, I think we have some drafts floating around in the ad working group talking about how to reduce the dependency on the CA. Right, currently the both the mechanisms require, if you're doing verified discovery or you are doing DNR based one, right? You need a public CA basically to issue certs. Otherwise, the bootstrapping problem can't be solved. The client can't validate if whether your certificate is authentic, right? And I think we had presented a couple of solutions on how we have done it and the limitations that we're facing because of we can't do that with Let's Encrypt for Imagine because they treat it as a DOS attack that you're going to ask them for millions of subdomains, right? And unless you have a business agreement with them and you pay them some revenue for basically supporting Let's Encrypt, they are not ready to support us, and they were not giving us the exact time within which a certificate can be issued, right? So what we have done is that when we presented the potential solutions at IETF in the ad working group, there was basically an ask from the working group members that this problem is a much bigger problem, that especially if you're hosting servers, right, or if you're talking to a printer, or if you're talking to some other device within the network, right, we're still relying on HTTP. And if you're going to fall back to HTTPS, then it's all going to be self-signed certificates. Or we have a dependency on the CA basically to issue those certificates, which is not a scalable option. So to address that, right, we have started a new mailing list called Settle. All right, it's sponsored by Eric, who's our AD for ad working group. So the idea is basically, how do you host servers in your local network which can be reached today securely, and you don't want to have dependencies on CA. So hopefully we'll have more discussions. This problem was presented in I think all dispatch, and there was some interest in solving this problem. So hoping to see that we'll figure out a way to create a BOF and then form a working group out of this, and then we'll be able to solve this problem, which will not only help the encrypted DNS use case, but other problems as well that we're facing in home networks.
You're on mute, Andrew.
Thank you. Thanks for that, Neil. Sorry, I was just saying, thanks for that, Tiru. I'll put a note on the mailing list with a link to the Settle. With the notes to this call, rather, with a link to the Settle mailing list for anyone that wishes to join that. Perhaps I've missed that, just for people's information. Okay, right, let's just briefly move on. So thank you, Neil, Tiru, John and David. That was I think an interesting update, so good to hear your respective sort of points on that. I'll just very briefly, to stick within the allotted time, go back to sharing my screen. Just to say, again, mailing list, those of you that get the weekly headlines would have had these, so I won't go through all of these in detail, but since we touched on the Zero Trust DNS, Microsoft announced last week that enterprise customers can sign up to the private preview now. That came out as well as there was some information on 3 sort of different Azure DNS related announcements as well. So read those at your leisure. Infoblox is doing a webinar looking back on the year on some of the DNS threat intel, which will be of interest, I think, to some of you. And there was a further piece on NIS2 directive and the implications for vulnerability management, just taking into account the lack of national implementation in some EU member states. So since we touched on NIS2 a few times, I thought that was worth highlighting. ECH, there was a good piece by Andrei Meshkov, the AdGuard CTO, just reflecting on what problem ECH does or doesn't solve, which I thought was quite an interesting, thoughtful piece, so worth a look. And similarly, a further piece on ECH and the implications for school content filtering, with particular reference to the US in that particular article. Again, worth a look, those of you with an interest in ECH. And actually, just one other one, the IGF Internet Governance Forum for 2025. It was announced a couple of weeks ago to take place in Norway. The dates are now available, 23rd to 27th of June in Lillestrøm in Norway. That's so it fits in just before the WSIS Plus 20 high-level meeting, which I think will be in July of this year. A few other pieces of interest, I'll just highlight 2. One, announcement from the European Council that they've approved a declaration on a common understanding of the application of international law to cyberspace. So those of you that have an interest more on the policy side of things. And similarly on policy, Nominet put out an interesting piece last week about their thoughts on further ways they can enhance the sort of domain safety, with particular reference to the .uk domain. This is going beyond what's required in legislation to try and have a bigger impact on DNS abuse, which caught my eye. A few deadlines coming up. If you want to comment on RIPE's relationship with the RIPE NCC, you've got till the end of today for that. Links in the headlines. Also, if you want to take part in the DNS Hackathon 2025, which is a 3-way partnership between RIPE, NetNod and OARC. You've got till the 1st of December to put your application in to participate. And also by the 2nd, that's a deadline for call for presentations for the OARC 44 meeting in Atlanta in February. So just a reminder, those are coming up. A few other things a bit later than that, but those are the immediate ones. And then finally from me, if you wanted to get a summary of stuff that occurred during the ICANN 81 meeting in Istanbul a couple of weeks back, then Echo are running their sort of regular sort of post ICANN meeting readout tomorrow. In fact, so you need to register, I think, for that before you can join. But so just a reminder that that's happening. If you wanted a quick synopsis of some of the highlights from the from the ICANN 81 meeting. So that's probably it for me. I'll say thank you to our call sponsors, DNS OR and Stop Sharing. And in the last 30 seconds or so, just pause to say, does anyone have anything else that you wanted to raise on the call before we finish our allotted time? And if so, just jump in, pop something in the chat, or just raise your virtual hand if that's easier. Not seeing anyone typing. Can't see any hands raised, so I'll assume not. So hope that was useful. Thanks again to our sort of main contributors, so Neil, Tiru, David, and John. Much appreciated with your insights in particular, and thanks everyone else for your attention. Have a fantastic week, and look forward to catching up same time next week. So have a great week all.